Chapter 12 of sdm4 talks about the difference between experiments, or randomized trials, and observational studies, or what we might call found data. It begins by defining observational studies on the bottom of in that first section, 12.1, and then really comparing them to be in section 12.2, randomized controlled trials or comparative experiments. Again, there's some real important differences between the two and little different approaches in how we'll be analyzing data from these two things. A little bit of a summary, a lovely example here from the Women's Health Initiative that really talks about the value of randomized trials, though it will not always be possible for us to be creating the environment for those to happen. The four principles of experimental design are outlined in section 12.3: control, randomize, replicate, and block. And so that's actually really helpful. We get some flow diagram for that and ways that we could actually think about designing an experiment in this section. And then this idea, kind of beginning with the precursors to informal inference, of whether something is statistically significant. And that's really described in this section. There's a nice just checking that I would recommend, as always, that you work through. The answers in the back of the book. This idea of experiments and samples, and then control treatments, how we put those together, what's ethical, what's not. We're not going to be focusing a lot on ethical questions within this course, but those are always very important ones. You've heard about the placebo effect that's described here, and really kind of describing and summarizing the approaches of randomized, comparative, double-blind, and placebo-controlled studies. Blocking is an approach where if we have a certain amount of variability we can explain, we can go ahead and randomize within blocks. It's really thinking about the randomized study side. However, a really important concept is that of confounding, where we kind of think about how, for observational data, we run into issues and problems that there might be other factors that are causing an association that we observe. And this idea of whether or not we have a confounding variable, this graphical display that we see here on the side, is there some kind of lurking variable or confounding variable, z, that might be confounding or conflating the relationship between x, the predictor, and y, some outcome. And that diagram or variance of it is something we're going to be seeing a lot as the course proceeds. So this section, kind of concludes with learning objectives for this chapter. Second chapter of design. In a perfect world, I might have actually liked to see these chapters a little bit earlier in the book, but we now have kind of a sense of univariate and bivariate analyses, and then really thinking about these questions of non-sampling error and ways we can actually come up with more efficient approaches to things, lead us in a good position moving forward.